In this tutorial, we're going to walk through a setup to perform a full song. I've set this up to be played with either 3 or 2 sensors. You have access to both setups in the SPS file. The SPS file is available on my Patreon. The link for that is in the description of this video. Regardless of how many sensors you have, I'd encourage you to check out both setups. I'm going to explain most of the song with a 3-sensor setup, just because it's a bit roomier in how things are laid out. But there are several tricks in the 2-sensor setup that are worth understanding, so don't miss out. The channels in the SPS file are as follows: kick on 1, snare 2, and, if you have it, tom on 3. To walk through the thinking behind this setup, I have a lot of samplers and controllers disabled. We'll activate them as we find the need for them. So if you're following along in the SPS file, you should open it to find most everything disabled except for a kick and snap sound. Right now they are pretty static sounding, but we do have control over their velocities. We can do a lot with this snap. A good start is to modulate the pitch, so let's activate this all pads velocity controller mapped to sampler pitch of the center zone. I have this set up to modulate the sample's pitch down as we play harder with the range settings. Feel free to change and tweak this to your liking. My thinking is that the lighter ghost strokes can be hi-hat-esque. To enhance the high end and add another dimension of movement, enable the timbre controller down here, which is mapped to a high-pass filter cutoff and resonance. Again, please adjust all of these controllers to your taste and your playing. Now we have a pretty nice triage of sounds with some movement, but they are all short sounds. To get some sustain into the mix, activate this speed controller, which does a couple things. One is to mix in the Sunhouse mod, which sort of stretches out the snap sound a bit. At the same time, we're also modulating Send 1 on this drum, which is strapped with this nice chain of effects to verb and warp out our sound. It's a bit of an unorthodox approach to the sustained percussion sound, which could have been much more simply solved with a nice cymbal sample, but I think this is more interesting because it's quite interactive. For melody, I have a cycle of 4 samples on the rim of our tom. I took the approach of creating a melodic segment per sample rather than individual notes. I made this call because this is sort of the hook of this section. Having it more set in stone frees me up to be expressive with everything else, while this hook stands strong like a melodic pillar. We do have some control over the sound of these melodic segments, though. Notice that I have 2 versions of these phrases on different samplers. The bowed samples are quite harsh and scratchy compared to the strummed samples. I set velocity to do some very subtle mixing between these 2 variations. Now we need a bass line. In the past, I've either put bass with the melodic or chord samples, or dedicated a whole drum to playing a bass line. But recently, I've had the revelation of the glory of pitched kicks. On your kick channel, you'll find a sampler that has been bypassed until now, containing your bass line. Here's how it works. The rim of your tom with the melodic samples on it is also advancing through these bass samples. We also have this random LFO modulating pitch of the bass samples, but it's restricted to just octave switching. Between the LFO octave switches and the slower harmonic pace of the melodic samples, we have a really nice feeling bass line that's intuitive to play and quite functional. For another melodic voice, I have these samples on the head of our tom. These are individual pitches, being randomly octave shifted and are set to cycle. This makes for a fun, unpredictable, yet hopefully palatable lead line. Note that the edge-to-center timbre controller mixes in some overdrive. Any chance you have to utilize a controller for some artist input, I highly encourage you to do so. Even really subtle modulation gives sample-based music a ton of life. This feels like a lead line, and it's a nice counter to our melodic cycle on the rim. Letting the bass ride out on whatever note you left it on is a nice change too. To really make this feel like another section, let's incorporate the stick shot on the tom. This is a cycle of samples that feel like something a keys player would play while comping under somebody's solo. Now we have two distinct feeling parts of a song just by playing different areas of our kit. For a wild card, enable this sampler on the rim of your snare. This is me talking through the previous tutorial in this series, but in reverse. To make this utterly random addition interlock with everything else we're doing, I set up a velocity controller on the kick to pitch the sample down and the snare to pitch it back up. The speed controller on our snare also pitches up the sample 2 octaves, which sounds like fast forwarding, which feels right for buzz strokes. Our lead line on the tom head turns the volume all the way down on this talking sample, and as soon as we hit another drum, the sample is turned back up. Finally, our stick shot comp chords are in a choke group with the talking. Since this sample is like 15 minutes long, it's pretty necessary to be able to stop it. Now all of this is on one kit. We have other kits at our disposal and the new ability to establish kit transitions. In a full song solo performance like this mode, which allows already playing samples to finish, will serve us well to make seamless transitions. To transition between kits, simply do a stick shot on your snare. I have stick shot velocity mapped to this kit selection arrow, so as long as your stick shot passes this threshold, you will immediately switch to the next kit you have loaded up. Note that this controller is pinned to the entire set, meaning that it will apply to every kit in this file. While we're on the subject, I've set up the dampened edge zone to navigate kits in the other direction. This gives you the option to navigate your song sections on the fly. A simpler approach would be to decide your song arrangement ahead of time and advance through the song sections so you don't have to pay attention to where you are in this row of kits. This B section is a simpler version of the A section setup. We have kick, snare, and hi-hat on the edge of the snare head. This snare sound is a mixture of a snap and snare sample, each on their own sampler. Enable this center velocity controller to animate this layering a bit. As we play harder, the snap pitches up and the snare sample gets more mixed in. 2 sounds in motion, cool on their own, even stronger together. Rather than making buzzes create high-pitched, sustained sounds, for this section, we're going the other way, forcing our snap to go very low. This feels kind of glitchy to me, which is a nice change up from what we had going in the A section. I have 2 chords on the rim of the tom. They're longer samples with some interesting textures that evolve. Let's give those a listen. This is a good time to point out that there's no reason why you should not make your own samples that serve your needs. This was made entirely with stock plugins and some automation of effects. Bounce it out, throw it onto your zone, and you have a mini composition ready for you whenever you need it. The chords toggle samplers on this kick. Go ahead and enable those just to get some bass going. They're pitched kicks like the last section, but the setup is a bit different just to showcase a different workflow. Instead of cycling through a chord progression, each of these samplers is enabled to support the appropriate rim chord. Samples are selected at random, and I tune them to work with the chords they belong to. On the head of the tom, we have a cycle of melodic samples that goes nicely over the chords and bass line. This features some fast picking, which contrasts nicely with the slow harmonic pace. Speed pitches them up, which sounds like pixie dust. For a breakup to this section, check out the rim of your snare, which features a sample I have of Preston Lovinggood. I like using it as a way to pause everything else and let the tension of the sample do the work for you. It's in a choke group with the kick, so just come back in whenever you're ready. The C section is more low-key. On your snare, you have a lot of melodic content, randomly selected pitches quantized to a scale, but you determine the velocity and the instrument sounding. On the tom, there's a snap. Playing towards the edge mixes in a delay. This is a nice setup for melody and groove. Enable this second sampler on the tom head for a cycle of notes to counter the snare drum random melody. My thinking here is that the random melody might feel less random when paired with a progression our ears can latch onto. For bass, hit the rim of your snare. It's a cycle of 3 notes. They're in a choke group with the melodic cycle on your tom. If you want the bass notes to ring out fully and still put in a backbeat, enable this sampler on your snare. Note that its velocity I/O only accepts higher velocities, so you can still play your random melody without backbeats all over it. Let's do a run through of the song and see how it all comes together, and then we'll move on to the 2-drum setup. We can do pretty much everything we did with the 3-drum setup with just 2 sensors. Let's go over the differences in how it's set up. The cycle of melodic figures is now on the rim of our snare. If you recall, in our A section with 3 sensors, we had a part within a part by playing different zones on our tom. I split that section off into its own kit. You can use the dampened edge zone to navigate to the left back to the first part, or I would recommend creating duplicate kits up here and only navigating to the right. In this case, we're going back to A1 just once before moving on to the B section. The only difference in this second A1 section is that I have an extra sample loaded onto the stick shot to play over our B section. This is those harmonics we were cycling through on our tom head before, but we can leave it loop here and achieve mostly the same effect. This is going to play until we navigate to the following section, because it's in a choke group with the next stick shot. You might quickly notice that the reversed vocal sample is now on the edge. While you probably are going to play the edge fairly often, this sample is again in a choke group with your kick, so you probably won't hear much of it as long as you're playing a full beat. This setup is a nice way to force yourself to give your song some space. The C section is similar since a lot of the action was already on our snare. The big bass notes are now on the rim of your kick. The snaps and melodic cycle are on the rim of the snare. You may notice how those ethereal sounds that were on the rim of your tom in the 3-sensor setup are now on the edge zone. Notice I have these samples selected at random, and while there are 10 variations, there are also many instances of silent samples in there as well. This creates an element of chance, so those ethereal sounds only happen sometimes. Thanks for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. Feel free to get in touch via email or Patreon with any questions, or if you want to share your performance of this song. In the next tutorial, we'll look at using sensory percussion with Ableton Live.